Who had grandparents fight in WW2 and what stories did they share? I think Grandpa saw some shit because he never talked about it, and we later found out that he was lying when he said he never saw action. None at all. My grandpa went to Europe as a teenager and it must have been messed up because he never talked about his experience all the way up to his death. He came back with 3 medals and nobody in the family knows what he did to get them. My grandpa was in the army. He never spoke about his service but he was shot in the ankle and captured. He spent years in a VA hospital once he returned to the States. I heard second-hand stories about the POW camp. Specifically how the guards would smoke cigarettes and then intentionally flick the butts just out of reach of the prisoners inside the fence. He and his buddies devised a tool to reach out through the fence and grab the butts when the guard turned their back. They'd then pass the butt between them to get a tiny puff. He was a very kind, very quiet, very intelligent man who had a very bad drinking problem. Edited. Thanks for all the responses and awards. Both my grandfathers served in the U.S. Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German AA Gun 1 mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children, or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories he'd reply, "I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another," would turn his hearing aid off, and nap in his chair. My grandfather was a train medic, not front line but where they took immediate survivors. The Germans were known to sabotage train bridges and it was standard protocol to stop and inspect them before crossing. Well, his conductor was drunk and not only didn't stop but was speeding into the bridge when it exploded. My aunt has the pictures but let's just say the rubble he was found under. Wooden trains don't just derail, they shatter, especially off a bridge, was crazy. He described it to me and I wanted to cry. He lost many friends. My paternal grandfather landed on Omaha on D-Day. That's it, that's all he ever shared. We know he spent the duration of the war in Europe, but whatever he saw or did was too much to ever tell my grandmother, dad, aunt, or uncle. My grandpa on my dad's side was 17 at the time and lied about his age to get into the Navy. He played saxophone in the Navy band aboard ships in the Pacific. I don't think he ever saw action, though, aside from that 6 sax action of course. My granddad was in WW2 in a tank destroyer unit. He never talked about it but when I got back from a trip to Paris in high school he asked if it was still all blowed up over there. And said the last time he was there it was a big old mess. Grandfather was a US sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a cocky officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them they were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, "If there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, take 1 step forward." Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. My grandfather's friend has a story about a guy who said he was deaf so that he wouldn't go to the war. The guy choosing the people tossed a coin in the floor besides him and he immediately searched for it. He was sent to the war. Grandfather trained in Canada with British officers before flying to Britain. Went to Italy, was almost killed when his jeep drove off a cliff to avoid capture by Nazis. Was taken back to Britain to heal, looked up the family of an officer he knew. Officer's sister became my grandmother. My Austrian grandfather was drafted into the Wehrmacht and his unit was integrated into the SS in 1944. He was wounded in January 45 in the Battle of the Bulge whilst carrying out an attack on a US position. He got patched up by the Americans whilst the German officer wrote a letter home that he was missing in action. He still has the original letter. He was a prisoner of war in France from then on and had to stay until 46 or 47 as he was captured as a member of the SS and they were held longer than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. He still holds a grudge against the Nazis for stealing his youth and still has some shell or bullet fragments in his chest as far as I know. Cheers to the Americans for saving him. When my grandmother died, we helped my grandfather move out of his house into an apartment. I had found a mason jar filled with old shiny rocks in his basement. When we looked closer, we realized it was gold teeth, aka kills from the war. That's when I learned my grandfather was a sniper. He served on the Pacific side fighting the Japanese. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 99. Well into his 90s though, he could still shoot a squirrel, with a gun and a slingshot, from a pretty long distance. He met up with the men in his unit every year after the war, until they all died. My grandpa was in the Navy and was a rear gunner on a plane. He was still training when the war was finishing up, but the story goes that he was trying to shoot a target on the ground for training. He was adamant on hitting it, so he unbuckled himself to get a better shot. Because of this he got pulled out of the plane and was hanging on only by the rear gun. Eventually he was able to pull himself back into the plane surprisingly. He probably never tried that again. My grandfather enlisted when he was 14, served in India for some years, but got shot by a sniper and was shipped back to UK. My grandfather lied about his age and joined the Marines. Went to Iwo Jima and got his thumb shot off. Came home and rode shotgun for Wells Fargo armored trucks. There was a bombing and a friend of my grandfather was hiding under the table, but it collapsed on him, leaving him with a brain injury that would give him flashbacks from time to time where he again thought bombers are coming. To not get hit again he always started to run out of the building he was in. Once he jumped out of the second floor of a building because of it, and that was it for him. My grandfather fled his home in Austria as a 12-year-old because he was Jewish. He and his parents were sent to the Viennese ghetto where he convinced two Nazis to let them flee under the cover of night. They eventually made it to Genoa where they caught the second-to-last ship leaving the port there. He lost his sister to the chamber unfortunately, but he and his parents fled to Japanese-occupied Shanghai, China, where they lived in the slums for around 8 years. He worked as a snake catcher, black market trader, and eventually as a foot messenger for the U.S. Army consulate there. He was also either the sole survivor or one of very few survivors of a U.S. lead bombing at an radio station there. Both granddads in the Navy. Great aunt survived a concentration camp. No one says anything. Ever. WW2 was like Fight Club, apparently. My grandfather was in World War II and then was called up for Korea. He told my mom that he was in special forces and that his primary weapon was the garrote. He refused to tell her any stories. And he committed suicide. Not my true grandparents, but my grandma's oldest brother. He fought in the Pacific through hell and back. He went by Pearl Harbor the day after and the Arizona was still on fire. One island he landed on had so much opposition that he had to use the guys in front of him bodies as meat shields. One funny story was that everyone at the base knew he didn't drink or smoke since his father was a raging alcoholic, so his bunkmates hid their booze under his bunk whenever the officers would come by and inspect camp. I unfortunately never met him, but hearing about his stories really fueled my interest in stories from throughout modern wars, from WW1 to Iraq. Edit, damn, this blew up overnight. Not grandparents but great-grandfather, he joined Tito's partisans in 1942 and fought mainly in eastern Croatia, northern and western Bosnia and Herzegovina. He got very sick in early 1943 and almost died due to dysentery. What influenced him the most, however, was the hunger and the cold they had to endure. This led to him always stockpiling on food and firewood and always needing to be sure that everyone also stockpiled on food and firewood as much as possible. Grandfather on my mom's side. He was in Europe somewhere guarding munitions that were stored in a railcar. He went into the munitions railcar and sat down to have a smoke. Gotta love the 40s. About 5 minutes later a German soldier hops into the railcar, locks eyes with my grandpa and they both proceed to shit their pants and freeze. A few moments pass and my grandpa offers him a cigarette. They sit there smoking a while before the German motions to the door and my grandpa nods. German vacates the area and grandpa continues with his duties. Both grandfathers, both survived, both only ever spoke about it to anyone on at most 2 occasions each. The only thing either of them ever said to me, as part of a larger family collective, about it was that the only thing you need to know about the war is that the people who didn't leave their corpse in the field left their soul instead. Those were the prices for coming home, and someone else decided which one you paid. My uncle was tasked with pulling bodies out of the ocean after D-Day. He was supposed to be in the invasion but his officer reassigned him due to his age. He then became personal details for Eisenhower due to more people looking out for him. My grandma was in the Merchant Marines and stationed on Lake Michigan. She was in charge of a Navy shipping yard. She said the hardest part was getting the men to look up from her chest. Then she got a master's degree in occupational therapy and worked for the Veterans Affairs. My one grandfather refused to ever talk about the war with anyone. Both of mine actually served in World War II but I never heard any stories. Well, my father and uncles all fought in World War II. I had 2 aunts who were also in the service. A grandfather fought in WW2. I grew up on the stories and his stories were the most upsetting. The way the command just threw everyone's lives away with the suicidal charges from the trenches, 67 years later, those stories still haunt me. One uncle was in North Africa, Papa, one uncle and 2 uncles-in-law served in the Pacific. One uncle, the youngest, was on Omaha Beach and helped liberate a small concentration camp near what would become East Germany. His stories are the ones I remember best. The stench that hit the American convoy about a mile from the gates, the walking skeletons, the half-decomposed bodies and the dogs eating them. Unlike movies, war is not pretty and rarely does it have any happy endings. My great-grandfather who never had an education beyond 5th grade was discovered to be a math prodigy by the Army. He was made an aviation engineer and if it wasn't for his poor eyesight could have been a pilot. He was stationed in India and as a corporal was the subject matter expert for the manufacturing of aircraft. Officers and senior NCOs had to refer to him when it came to technical matters. He also was allowed to test fly a lot of the airplanes since he rather have it fail on him than someone else. Shortly after Japan surrendered and the war was ending, a new captain was put in charge and forbade my grandfather from test flying as he wasn't a full-fledged pilot. Enraged, my grandfather took a plane one early morning and started flying. The noise caused everyone to come out from the barracks and when all the officers came out he dived down and flew close to their heads that they all dropped to the floor and covered their heads. For that stunt he was discharged from service and went on to start his own mechanic shop which he ran with my grandfather, his son-in-law, for 30 years. I am half German, my grandfather was in war. I never had the chance to talk with him about WW2, because he didn't like to speak about it and later also got ill so I hadn't any chance. Only thing I know from my uncle is that he was a sniper. He went to war I think in 1945 when he was 18 years old, when it was already clear that Nazi Germany will lose this war. He was somewhere in East Europe and got caught like many others by the Russians, so he was a war captivity. He managed to escape by jumping off a driving truck where he and many other captives were sitting on, and the Russians didn't notice, or noticed when it was already too late. He was then a few days on the run. He slept in the forest, till he got back to Germany to the house of his grandmother where he hided till the war was over, because he was deserter, normally he had to go back to war. I hope you could understand it, sorry for my bad English. My maternal grandfather, Canada, our Regiment C, was about to get on the boat for the Dieppe raid and got pulled off at the last minute and put into intelligence. The guy that replaced him didn't make it. He spent a bunch of the war doing photo analysis and helped with the man that never was. Also, there's a famous story where Jen Patton, US, was to be told to wait for Jen Montgomery, UK, before entering Germany. Apparently, Gramps was the poor young officer who got to tell him. Ich dien. Had an uncle who was crew on a bomber in Europe who got shot down over Germany and spent the rest of the war as a POW. He never talked a whole lot about his experiences as only him and one other from his crew survived. My grandfather was drafted into World War I. He was from a ranching family in Wyoming and very skilled with horses, but he didn't want to end up in the mule artillery. He lied to the army and told them he worked in a dry goods store, so they made him a supply clerk. He was eventually put on a ship to France and arrived just as the war ended. He said all the soldiers went AWOL and partied for several days. I suspect it was an eye-opening experience for a country boy. My grandfather went to France 4 to 5 months after D-Day, eventually moved into southern Germany. They went ahead to take out snipers. Only 3 things he ever said was a guy lit a cigarette at night and a sniper picked him off. The French girls were giving Americans kisses in the streets, he loved that, and he saw a concentration camp firsthand. Grandfather on father's side. Soviet Army, the Great Patriotic War. 117th Rifle Division, very low food supplies. They had to take food from dead Germans and make horse meat stew taken from farms. He said you can get used to all the killing, however being cold and hungry you can never get used to. Grandfather on mother's side. U.S. Army 2nd Infantry Division. Once his squad had to sneak to the side of a panzer tank and throw some logs and rocks into the tracks to disable it. They had no anti-tank, while the other squad took out the German infantry. Once the tank was disabled, the hatch opened and they took German tank commander and crew prisoner. The Germans were scared and sickly looking. He said he thinks they knew they would lose the war. They were in France and they hadn't eaten hot food in days. There was a hot apple pie on the window sill and they liberated it. On the way to the camp, they dropped it pie side down into a pile of fresh horse shit. He said the pie was delicious. My grandfather was a U.S. Air Force navigator. There's a story of flying a Russian trader and his mistress back to the USSR after they escaped to Italy. They were shot on the runway and Russian agents took his team out for a night on the town. My grandmother had a boy who was in love with her who was in the U.S. military. We recently found a Nazi flag he brought back to her. The young soldier wrote on it "Home alive in 45, best regards R." She didn't end up marrying the guy. My grandfather went ahead of the front line to deactivate bombs, report sabotage, or commit sabotage. Once he had the mission to bomb a large Nazi party in France to eliminate some officials all at once. While he was setting up some charges, he made contact with the drummer of the band playing the music for the party and signaled to him what was going to happen. The band then called 5 and avoided their deaths in the explosion. That drummer went on to start the Mainel Cymbal Company and thanked my grandfather profusely for what he did years later at the Frankfurt NAM convention. One of my favorite memories of my grandfather, who was literally like a Hallmark movie grandpa, is of him telling me about his time working in the mess hall. He proudly told me he could crack 8 eggs at once. And promptly got 8 eggs out of the fridge, picked up 4 in each hand, cracked them into a bowl, and threw away the empty shells. Then my grandma found out and made him take me to the store and immediately buy more eggs. My grandfather never spoke of his experience during his lifetime to me, but a cousin interviewed him for a film project. It was after his funeral that my siblings and I learned that he was a higher level dude, don't ask me what, and involved with a camp liberation. He told a story about what it was like to walk into the camp, the smell, the hallowed prisoners, and the Nazis fleeing, the begging for food, and how you can't just feed a starving person. The part that sticks with me is that he said a group of prisoners had gotten a Nazi and were beating him. His fellow army guys asked him if they should intervene and arrest him, kill the Nazi, or let them kill the guy. It was up to him, so he said he just turned and walked away, letting the prisoners kill the guy. He died before I ever heard this, which is fair, as no one wants to tell their grandkids these kinds of stories. He didn't even tell my dad about it. They always had a lot of respect for his service, so I'm sure he spoke of other parts of the experience, but very edited. I believe we have it as a sound file somewhere.